right, so I have a whole bunch of Neil Young records I want to tell you about. I guess these would be sort of my reviews of these Neil Young records. I don't know. I listen to Neil Young almost every day of my life. At least a few songs from Neil trickle into my ears every day, honestly, one way or another. A lot of them are through these records, a lot of them are through the Neil Young archives. I want to sort of explore the collection with you as a way to sort of, I don't know, wrap my mind around why I like Neil Young so much. I don't know. As I get older, he's the only artist that really perseveres for so many years or decades in terms of my love and interest, and not only that, but actually listening to him. I still love a million bands, but I don't necessarily listen to them every day. And I wonder what it is about Neil Young, like what quality. As I sort of like troll through YouTube, the Neil Young archives, look at all these message boards, all the Neil Young heads. I understand that I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people who sort of like have taken the journey with Neil Young, and by that I really mean like taking their life journey with Neil Young as the soundtrack. I'm not entirely sure why that is, and I think maybe talking about it will help. So let's go through some of the stuff I have on vinyl. Again, this is not a complete collection, and in fact, some of my absolute favorite Neil Young compositions and albums are things I listen to entirely either on YouTube Music or not Spotify, the other streaming services you can find Neil on. But here's a few records for you. We'll start with something basic, something we all should have in the collection. After the Gold Rush, this is 1970. I sort of want to again give you an idea of how these records feel because I'm not going to play any of them. I'll just kind of talk about them. After the Gold Rush is it's got that kind of like rootsy Topanga Canyon folky vibe, but there's something going on in After the Gold Rush with this sort of like ecological, environmental, apocalyptic theme. I don't know. I think of this album a lot in connection to Radiohead for whatever reason, and this might come up again. I think there's a reason why Radiohead and Neil Young are two of my absolute favorite musical artists. They're connected, and if you listen to interviews with Tom York, he like sort of fashioned his singing voice in part around Neil Young. And if you listen to Radiohead, it sounds a lot like Neil Young has like some sort of weird electronic art rock band behind him with Tom's voice. But either way, there's a cover you can hear of after the song After the Gold Rush by Tom York, in which I think he's playing the same piano that Neil plays. And it's sort of uncanny, the connection there. And the only reason I bring it up is because I think, both of these artists, and this is another maybe root of both of them, Neil Young and Radiohead, is this sort of like being able to capture a certain feeling of apocalypse, of disaster, of collapse. At the same time, there's just sort of like, I don't know, really kind of stoned, beautiful take on that collapse. And that's sort of been, I don't know, where I've been sitting in just my sort of like historical position in my life. And I think that's part of the reason why these songs are so appealing. But After the Gold Rush is one that, again, has a lot of the big hits on it. I think it's got, let's see, Southern Man is on here. And this is also an album that has a lot of just great musicality to it. This is when Nils Lofgren starts playing more with Neil adding a lot of piano and guitar touches that are sort of signatures of the sound. This is just a really great album. All right, I'm going to move on because I have a bunch of others I want to share. This is in no particular order, by the way, so as I go through these, we're going to jump around in time, but I think that's okay because we'll be able to sort of frame our own lives alongside Neil's. So this album, Toast, this just came out a couple years ago, but was recorded, I think, in the year 2000. This album is really interesting in part because Neil was it's one of a number of several albums I think that Neil recorded and songs that he recorded that he decided he didn't want to put out for whatever reason. And this one he didn't want to put out for like emotional reasons. He reported later, and again, he put this out in like 2021 or 22, that this album was just too heavy, that the themes were just too dark for him. I love the sort of inset inside. Check that out. Neil can't even show you his eyes. They're blacked out. This period, I guess, was a dark time he's going through in his relationships, etc. But this album has such a groove to it. And it's funny because when Neil comes back to it and releases it 20 years later, his comments on it are like, I should have just put it out. It's so good. This is one I put on all the time. I put Toast on all the time, in part because it's got an opening groove that captures something about Neil's electric guitar tone. A lot of people talk about this. He has a tone to his electric guitars that just has the right amount of fuzz and nostalgia and rock to it. That whenever I put Toast on, you're just instantly in that fuzz and in that groove of his guitar work. And again, this is a like kind of this is a Crazy Horse album, right? Okay, so for those that don't know, Neil plays every once in a while with this band Crazy Horse. And the Crazy Horse albums always are, to me, like loose and rocky and funny, and Neil, honestly, at his best. I think there's a reason why he records with Crazy Horse a lot, in part because it brings out this element of Neil that's a core part of his personality. This sort of tongue-in-cheek, garage rock, old man rock band that Crazy Horse is. And I think they were old men even when they were in their 20s and 30s. But Toast is so fucking good. And yeah, it's dark. I understand in part why Neil didn't want to put it out at the time, because it's revealing. This is like an emo Neil album, Toast, in part because there are turns of phrase. If you listen to a lot of Neil Young, you know, he's a poet and he often inhabits characters, and he's not really talking as Neil Young. He's like someone else. But in this album, he is revealing more of himself. This is sort of like the Bob Dylan Blood on the Tracks album a little bit, in the sense that you hear Neil seeming to reveal pieces of insecurity and sort of self-hatred even, and self-judgment in ways that you don't generally see, even self-pity. But I just dig this record, and it's got some rockin' songs on it. Toast is one that I would... I don't know. I think if you haven't checked this album out, I think it would surprise you how deep and fun these songs are. Okay. So then, this is like going all the way back in time now. We're really shifting dramatically. But this is Neil's first solo album, just called Neil Young. I love this album. This has got a real twangy country vibe to it. I remember, I think this was maybe the first vinyl Neil Young record I owned. I got it at a thrift store. This is not the copy. I had to replace my thrift store records at some point because they got lost. It's a long story. But either way, I have a sort of nostalgia in part for putting this album on in the maybe early 2000s. Neil's solo debut is it's kind of countrified, and I love that about it. I'm trying to think of the big songs that are on this. Oh, Old Laughing Lady. Oh, and this has got a Last Trip to Tulsa, which is this 10-minute folk extravaganza at the end of this album, in which it's just Neil and an acoustic guitar. And I can honestly say, just on this recording, and he does it live on other albums, but that recording of Last Trip to Tulsa on this album is probably the hardest I've ever heard a person beat an acoustic guitar. I'm not sure how he didn't break it recording the song. But what's incredible is like he stays in rhythm with this Neil Young chop on those acoustic strings. It just gets so intense that it's like, I don't know, it perfectly encapsulates a little bit of what I love about Neil, is that he'll shred an acoustic guitar. Like even when he's doing the soft folk stuff, there's an energy to it that's just barely underneath the surface. And maybe We'll get to that when we get to the 90s grunge stuff. But there's a rage to Neil Young. I mean, he's an angry fucking guy. And despite the fact that there's I think, very strong like association with him with the 60s and a sort of like folky peace movement, he's a lot like me. And if you listen to Nostalgia Trap or read my Twitter over the years, I think there's a lot of similarities, and it explains a lot of why I love Neil Young, is that I feel a lot of the same way. Like, I get the peace and love thing. I want to be that guy. But there's also like a deep anger underneath the surface. And Neil's like playing these beautiful, soft folk songs, but then he's also just going to beat the shit out of that guitar eventually as the energy just surges out of him. I love that barely contained rage underneath the surface of the like loving, compassionate guy that's trying very hard to create peace and love in the world. That's Neil. And I guess in some ways that's me too. Okay. Moving on. Okay, here's an important piece that I think if you're a sort of new to Neil Young and you want to move beyond just the typical like after the gold rush harvest stuff, and you want to get deeper into this guy, Decade. This came out in, I think, like 1977, somewhere in there. I think this album put Neil out there in a way that he hadn't been before. What I mean by that is this was a huge hit. I think he made a ton of money off of this. And this collection, this is 3 different vinyl records inside. A ton of songs. This one's got like a ton of stuff, Old Man, A Man Needs a Maid, all that kind of stuff. Needle and the Damage Done, Winter Long, which is just one of my absolute favorite Neil Young songs. You got Cortez the Killer on here, which is arguably the greatest Neil Young guitar jam, and maybe the greatest Neil Young song, honestly. I'll talk about Cortez the Killer in a little bit. Either way, get Decade, because this album has it all. There are like, 50 songs on here or something. It's a way to spend a few hours with Neil, and I don't know, there's something about the way these songs unfurl where you get to hear the first 10 years of him as a solo artist, and you can hear an evolution happening. Really good stuff. Get Decade. All right. Now we come to another, this is a sentimental, personal favorite. This is one that comes on at the house a lot. I think there was a period where I was putting this on every morning for a couple months. Every morning I woke up to this album. This is Comes a Time. This came out the same month I was born, which is October of 1978. And I think maybe that's partly why I feel I'm just the narcissistic connection. This is what Neil was up to when I entered the scene. But this album is like, this is Neil coming back to like a, countrified Nashville kind of sound. This is just a great set of songs. And I guarantee if you're not a Neil Young fan, you probably have not heard most of these songs, but you ought to, because they're just some of the greatest, just like straightforward American folk rock music of the late 1970s. And I don't really listen to that genre very much. I'm not like a James Taylor or Joni Mitchell person at all. I say Topanga Canyon. I sort of like Shudder. I'm not typically into much of that music. But this captures the sort of vibe of this stuff at its best. And you've got like, I put this on, this album goes by so quickly. I feel like I know this album inside and out. There's a song at the end called Motorcycle Mama. That's the second to last song. Whenever Motorcycle Mama comes on, which is a song that really showcases the voice of this woman, Nicolette Larson, who had kind of a tragic life, and Neil sang with her for a couple different albums and tours. Her voice is incredible. And on Motorcycle Mama, it's one of the few songs where the woman's voice is at the front and center. And it's got this kind of like really raunchy bar rock kind of thing going on, which is sort of counter to the tone of this whole album, that this album should sort of end with this sort of like Motorcycle Mama raunchy. I think a song that's like about like S&M and like slave sex and shit like that. I don't know. That's what I hear in Motorcycle Mama. Either way, this album's a lot of fun, and it ends with the song Four Strong Winds. I'll put that track list up there for you. Four Strong Winds is a song that I think means a lot to Neil. I just saw him play at the Santa Barbara Bowl last summer, the only time I've ever seen him, doing his Coastal Tour, which was just a solo tour of him on stage. It was awesome. We were close up. And that experience was like, I don't know. It's like seeing, I don't know, has that like kind of Walter Benjamin aura thing going on of like an actual person, right? Like a human being has this sort of masterful aura. So, and he looked like this, only a whole lot older. Anyway, he played Four Strong Winds at the end of that tour. And if you look at all the YouTube stuff of that tour last summer, Neil played Four Strong Winds at the end of every encore. That was the last song he played. And if you listen to it and listen to the sort of lyrics and tone of that song, there's a melancholy there, and there's sort of a bittersweet, if I ever come back again, sort of take. This is a cover song of like a Canadian folk song, but I think Neil, he played this song in the mirror to himself when he was a teenager. I think it's one of the songs that he first learned and got into learning music. But either way, there's a really beautiful version of it at the end of this, and it always, I don't know, this album is sort of a roller coaster of emotion. I love this one so much. Comes a Time is an absolute favorite. Now we get to some of the weird stuff. I do have a vinyl copy of Neil Young's Trans from the early 80s. Infamous album. This says on the back, by the way, there's a little note. I'll read you the note. It says, "This first edition pressing of Neil Young's Trans album contains a typographic mistake. Although it is listed in the lineup on the back of this record on the lyric inner sleeve, the song If You Got Love is not on the record itself." Isn't that a ripoff? This album's crazy. This album, if you don't know, is Neil's attempt to enter into the electronic music genre. He was kind of hanging out with Devo. I think there's a lot of Kraftwerk and Talking Heads on this album. There's a lot to be said about Neil and his sort of relationship in many ways to Paul McCartney's music. And I think Paul was up to the same thing with McCartney too in the early 80s, starting to experiment with electronic music and computers and all that shit. And if you listen to this album and you listen to McCartney too, you will hear a lot of similarities, I should say. This is a cool image of Neil with the little vocoder. This album is infamous in part because Neil sings into it sounds like auto-tune, honestly. This is in a lot of ways, this is a groundbreaking album. This is like Kanye's 808s and Heartbreaks. Is that what it was called? Where he sings like a robot for most of the time. And some people are into that and some people are not. Another, I don't know. It seems like another, I guess, kind of connection with Radiohead is that notion of blowing up your the kind of music that made you famous, straightforward rock music. No, we're throwing our guitars away and we got computers. I think that's an LCD Sound System song. But either way, Neil is definitely that guy. Neil has run from his fame on many occasions and tried to blow it up. And what better way to blow up your rock and roll fame than to throw away your guitars and start making a bunch of bleep bloop robot music. Trans, before I move on from Trans, I want to say I love Trans, and I want to pick it up again because this album does a lot for me, honestly. I love the electronic stuff. I love the vocoder, whatever the voice thing that is that he's doing. They still sound like Neil Young songs. The melodies are still there. The sentiments are so weird. He's definitely just zoned out on this album. I'm not sure the drug of choice on this album. But either way, what's really cool about this is there's an electronic weirdo version of Mr. Soul, which is like this 60s rock Buffalo Springfield song from Neil, a hit song he had in the mid-60s at some point. But then this album also ends with this song called Like an Inca, which is the most zoned out, psychedelic, Carlos Santana electric guitar jam in which Neil is singing about being an Inca, being an Aztec, making buildings in his mind. He's out of it, and it's so much fun. This album is like, I don't know, you get through all of the crazy electronic stuff, and then you're rewarded with this like 10-minute psychedelic jam. I'm into trance. I love trance. Trance can live forever. And honestly, some of the robot music is great. Check it out. All right. This is Tonight's the Night. This comes out in 1975. This has got a great photo in the middle. Check that out. Yeah. And a pretty cool zoned out one in the back. This is a very, very dark album. This is like, when I listened to this for the first time a few years ago, I thought, wow, that's Neil doing his like his best like art rock. But what this album really is an expression of grief and rage from a bunch of dudes that just lost their friends to drug overdoses. Particularly the guitarist from Crazy Horse, Danny Whitten, who Neil Young had fired the night he died of a drug overdose, and Bruce Berry, who Neil Young mentions on the album many times. Bruce Berry was a working man. He used to load that Econoline van, as the line goes over and over on this album. Bruce Berry's another guy that was one of their friends, a roadie, who OD'd. And so this is the beginning, or maybe the middle, somewhere, of the 1970s, and Neil Young really beginning to deal with the fallout of drugs from the 1960s, watching a bunch of his friends die, and really being lost in a bunch of drugs himself. Tonight's the Night is a fucking dark, weird journey of an album. This is one of those that not all of Neil's albums are like this, but this one really falls together as one piece, like you're hearing a play or a movie. It's a good album to put on, and honestly, light the candles, turn all the rest of the lights out, and do a nighttime thing. Because this album takes you to some really dark and really funny and weird places, and it's also made by people who are just completely fucked up, and you can hear that on the album. I think that actually Neil and the rest of them cringed a bit when they heard how off-key some of these songs are, but that's part of what makes it work. This is just like total punk rock shit, and it's I don't know. It's one of the albums that I feel like is the heaviest in some ways, and yet I love putting that one on. Okay, let's keep on trucking. Oh, we got so many. This guy has put out just wow. I hope everyone's still with me here. If you are, thank you. How's it going? Let's have a drink. When I say that, I mean let's have a drink of water. But you can have a drink of whatever you want. I once saw, it's the documentary for Barn, which is a Neil Young album we'll get to in a minute, a recent one, where you really get to see him working with Crazy Horse and what that's like. But there's a moment where he's sort of like sitting at the piano, and he's tinkering around on the piano. He's sort of uninspired, and he kind of yells out to nobody, "I need a beer." And someone at some point brings Neil a beer, and he sort of like just cracks open the bottle and chugs it. And this guy's like 76 years old in this video. Just chugs the beer, slams it down on the piano, and goes right into this song and just this like brilliant version of whatever he's playing. And it just reminded me, or just I guess showed me how much he needed that kickstart. It seemed like he just needed, it was like watching Popeye get a little bit of spinach. Just like he just needed a kickstart of a little bit of intoxication to drive him onto the piano, and let's play this fucking song. I don't know. There's a beautiful lesson there. All right, I'm good. I'm hydrated. Let's move on. This is Silver and Gold. This came out, I think, in 2000. The picture is by Neil Young's daughter from a Game Boy. It's another sort of like, I think, evidence of Neil as a kind of tech head in a way. As much as he's like a total hippie that thinks, we should just slow down and go back to the primitive life a little bit, go back to the garden. He's also kind of a tech head and a gear head. And the Game Boy thing totally makes sense. And the fact that Neil has the best internet archive of any artist I've ever seen makes sense as well. What about Silver and Gold? This album is, when I think about this album, the word that comes to mind is maturity. Neil is mature on this album. This is him I don't know, being an expert level songwriter. He's 45 years old when this album comes out. He's talking about like more adult stuff. He seems like he's not like just lost in like druggy abandon on this one, although maybe he was in the year 2000. But either way, on these songs, I don't know. There's a run of songs on here. Let me see. Which ones are they? Okay, I know what they are. Towards the end of this album, Red Sun, Distant Camera, and Razor Love. Those three songs together, I'm always just blown away by. So put those on, just those three. Red Sun, Distant Camera, Razor Love. They're just, I don't know. I feel like I want to soak in the atmosphere that's created sonically in these songs, but also the sentiments that are evoked about love, about relationships, about life are more complex and compelling than you generally hear from a lot of contemporary music and even Neil stuff, honestly. This is him his most like nostalgic and reflective. There's a song on here literally about Buffalo Springfield called Buffalo Springfield Again, where he's literally just like, I used to have a rock band. I miss those guys. I wish we could play with each other again. So check out Silver and Gold. This is like mid-career Neil Young at his absolute best. There's not a lot of like, I don't know if he plugs in at all on this album in terms of like rock and psychedelic music. This is just good guitar-driven, piano-driven, beautiful music. I love Silver and Gold. Starts with a really like straightforward, I don't know. It feels like a little bit like late career Wilco, a little bit, or mid career Wilco, in the sense of like, oh, here's a guy that's like mastered his music, and now he's going to tell me about what it's like to be 45 years old. And that resonates with some of us, all right? Do the math. All right, here's you got to have this. You have to have this album in your collection. This is On the Beach. This album is another one of those from the mid-1970s in which Neil is sort of losing his mind from being a celebrity. He's a little paranoid. He's still making music. And the music that comes out of him on the Beach is so dark and so groovy and so sort of like, I don't know, it's got like a fat, weighted, scary, distant, haunted, spooky, weird sound. The vibes on this album are absolutely out of control. It's one of just like I can hear so many of the like guitar changes on this album in my head right now in terms of the feeling that it evokes. On the Beach is a weird, fun, spooky little album, and I recommend it heavily for chilling out and reflecting. Okay, here's one that I don't really have to say much about. This is Neil Young's Harvest. Do I have it upside down? No, I don't have it upside down. This is the album that, I think broke him out into a wider audience like none other and created some of his biggest hits, signature songs like Harvest, like Heart of Gold, like Alabama, Old Man, The Needle and the Damage Done. You got to have this album. I think this album is like the one that everyone sells at Target or Urban Outfitters, wherever they sell records for $50 these days. But at some point, you could get a copy of Harvest at any thrift store for like $1 in like the 2000s when no one gave a fuck about vinyl. Now you got to pay more for it. Sorry, everybody. Analog ain't cheap. But Harvest, I honestly, I would say I don't put it on all that often, in part because I'm into all the kind of weird other shit that Neil does. Here's an example of that. Not that I put this album on all the time. This is Neil Young and the Blue Notes. This Note's for You. This is, I think, sometime in the late 80s. You can tell it's late 80s by the design on the back of this. Just horrible. This is like Neil doing like a Chicago blues record. So you've got like big saxophone sound on here. And, that works for some people, doesn't work for others. It really sounds like a Rolling Stones record in a lot of ways. But as always, with the stuff that Neil does where he puts out a record of like weird shit and he's just like, sorry, it's weird. This is what I want to do. I wanted to do a Chicago blues album with lots of saxophone. There's also like some songs that don't fit into that genre that he throws in there. I don't know if it's like a bone to his fans or whatever. But like there's some really fun stuff on this album and some songs that always surprise me. Whenever I put this one on, I start to roll my eyes like, oh no, here comes the like big Chicago blues 80s movie soundtrack. But there are songs on here that are kind of mind-blowing in their own way. So check this one out. I'm glad to have it. All right, so this is Neil Young and Crazy Horse album. Again, this is Rust Never Sleeps. This is a classic. You got to have this one. I know I keep saying you got to have. I guess there are quite a few that you got to have. But this one is another that at some point you could have found everywhere. I don't know if you can now. Look, it's got a $3.48, it says there. Wow. So Rust Never Sleeps is a live album, I think mostly a live album, if not all. It has the My, Hey, Hey, rock and roll is here to stay. It's better to burn out than it is to fade away, all that kind of stuff. It's also got this song Powderfinger on it, which I haven't mentioned, but Powderfinger is just like, God. Powderfinger is just an all-timer of a song in a lot of ways. And honestly, thinking about like soldiering and war and people being killed in war, Powderfinger is a sort of fever dream reduced to its the core elements of what it's like to be a young man facing violence. I don't know. There's something beautiful about Powderfinger in every way, and I love it so much. And I had to mention it because whenever it's on one of these albums, I'm happy to hear it. It's weird because it's like a really fun song to listen to. If you're not really listening to the lyrics, you're maybe not getting it. It's a song about a guy being shot to death. All right. Here's one I haven't really spent that much time with. This is one of Neil's new records, I think. With Crazy Horse, world record. This is obviously a very personal album. Neil's in a reflective mood. He's 78 years old. This album's got pictures of like, check this out. This is like Neil and his mom. That one? That's great. Great photos. And he's got pictures of his dad and siblings in here. Again, I haven't spent a lot of time listening to this record, and I will say, and this is fucked up to say, but I've heard a lot of other Neil heads say it, so I'll say it too. When Neil does the straightforward environmental stuff about saving the earth, it's not always my favorite music. It's not always the stuff I like the most. And that's not to say, I don't appreciate the environmentalism and the message about climate change. I get what he's doing, but the other part of me is like, dude, bury it in a metaphor, dude. You don't need to just sing about the rivers like directly. All right. Here's this is a funny story to this album. This is Time Fades Away. You may recognize or not recognize that Cameron Crowe in the film, I think Almost Famous, he duplicated that opening or that picture on the cover of this album for the opening scene of Almost Famous. Time Fades Away is, I think, a controversial album for Neil. He was pissed about the way this tour turned out. He didn't like the recording, and I think he buried a lot of this, but Time Fades Away remained like a cult album that you could get, and one of his most critically acclaimed. I understand in part why Neil didn't like this album. There are songs in which he was sort of like, again, like sort of like lashing out after Harvest and making a bunch of shit that he knew people wouldn't like or would maybe be challenged by. He didn't feel like playing the folk guy from Harvest that everybody loved. And part of me is like, I get it. And you know what, Neil? You did a good job because I don't want to listen to this. I'd rather put on Harvest. But Time Fades Away is really interesting. And if you're a Neil head, you gotta listen to some of these songs, because these songs are songs that don't really appear other places. It's not a live album where you hear Neil play all his hits. It's a live album where he played a bunch of shit that he never plays, and I think that's part of he wanted to sort of like hide that. So check that out. I did mention this one, the documentary. You can watch it on YouTube. I think Daryl Hannah made it. It's awesome. It's a chance to see Neil Young and Crazy Horse play together, and not only that, but the whole creative process. I watched it like 5 times. I learned a lot from it. But Neil Young's Barn, I love this album. This is a late career album. Came out, I think, in like 2000. I want to say 20 or 21, maybe 22, somewhere in there. There's some really beautiful songs on this, including the first song, Song of the Seasons, that really capture a lot, I feel like, of like where Neil is in his life in terms of reflecting on things. I don't know. I'm enjoying the late career stuff. I'm enjoying Neil as he reflects, and not only that, but sort of situates himself within the larger history of music. And of the movement, like the 60s. He's still sort of coming to terms with all of that, and I think that's important. So Barn is really cool, and this is, I don't know, this one does not annoy me, weirdly enough. Some of the later stuff with the, I don't know, the earthy shit does, but Barn is really great. I put it on all the time. Here is another Neil saying "fuck you" and doing whatever he wants. This is him dressed as Elvis at some point in the 80s, making like 1950s sort of pop record. These sound like the songs that Neil Young grew up with listening to 50s radio. It's early rock and roll stuff. It's, it all sounds like Chuck Berry songs, honestly. What's amazing about this is how good Neil is at duplicating that sound. But he's so good at it that the album just has a sort of tone of, okay, we're doing Malt Shop Memories. There's not a lot of songs that pop out to me as like, oh, I love, love, love this song. They feel like covers of covers in a lot of ways. I think the album is sort of like just impressive in the sense that Neil is able to just crank out any genre, and it would make sense because this stuff is in his DNA. 2 remaining albums, and we're through with the collection. This is, to me, I'm sorry, another must-have. Excuse me, American Stars and Bars. This is I don't know, a good album to put on when you're drinking. This is like, I mean, come on, look at Neil's face. He is smashed into the coffee table there. A lot of pills and drugs and booze around. This is the booziest Neil Young album. If you've had a few drinks, there's nothing better than American Stars and Bars. It has that kind of raunchy dive bar sound. There's a lot of women singing with him and backup singers. And there's a vibe. I think that Neil Young must have been screwing around with his neighbor's wife, because that theme comes back a few times. The songs are loose. They're funny. They're kind of wobbly and drunk. I love this album. This is a really, really funny album. It also has some of his bigger hits on it. I think Like a Hurricane is on here. And a song that's, I think, called Will to Love, that I always call the fish song. It's a song of where Neil is like singing as if he's a salmon. I think he's a salmon in that one. But yeah, the fish song is on here. This is a really fun album. American Stars and Bars is very much worth your time. A true original. I think that's late 70s when that comes out. All right, finally, we end with maybe this is like the NPR like Prestige album. This is the way I think of this one. This is Neil Young, playing Carnegie Hall in 1970. This is just him and an acoustic guitar. You really get to hear him. The sound quality on this album is tremendous. You can hear how expert he is at playing the acoustic guitar, obviously, and singing. The sound quality is amazing on this album. The other part you get is like a little onstage banter. You get to hear Neil's sort of weird, funny, stoned out vibe in 1970. I love this album. It's kind of an incredible document in the sense of documenting how one man can sit on a stage in front of thousands of people and be a sort of like humble dude who plays a few songs on the acoustic guitar and just transports that audience again and again and again with songs that are so inventive that they sort of, I think, transcend a lot of that genre of, I don't know, one dude with a acoustic guitar music, folk music, 60s stuff with a message, etc. Neil, again and again, to me, and this is maybe my final comments and maybe wraps up why he's important. Actually, I have two more things I want to share. But Neil, to me, sort of, I think that's why he remains a compelling artist. Even throughout all the like corny, what you would think would be like corny 1960s, 1970s, hippie, California folk sentiments, he transcends that by just being a badass. He's also got that psychedelic, drugged out, angry rocker personality that combines with that folk sentiment and gives it an edge and makes it not just, I don't know, Simon and Garfunkel or some bullshit like that. All right, Neil is the guy that perseveres when no one else does from that era for a reason, and it's because he kicks ass. All right. I want to give you an example, like where I was when I was in my early 20s. I asked a friend of mine, can you make me, and this is technology, right? I just shared all my vinyl records. Before there was the internet, and you could explore all this Neil Young music just on the internet, streaming music, before buying it, you had to spend a lot of money, and I didn't have that money. So I asked a friend of mine, would you make me a copy of Harvest Moon? I really wanted that. If you notice, I don't have Harvest Moon on vinyl. If someone wants to send me a copy, I want Harvest Moon. There are a couple of others that I really need. I don't know why I don't have Harvest Moon. Anyway, she made this for me. And that's for those that remember this era of people just like making you CDs and then like writing the name of of the album. This is what I had. So I said, thank you so much. And I went into my car, I think. I put it on, and it wasn't Harvest Moon. It was Harvest. Those are two very, very different albums. So I demanded that she make me the actual Harvest Moon. And I have evidence that this was, again, 25 years ago that she did. And there it is, Harvest Moon for real. So I have to remember now that the first one is the actual Harvest, even though it says Harvest Moon. So that's just, for me, evidence of being really interested and needy when it comes to Neil Young's music for a very long time. And I wanted to think about why.